The Toronto Blue Jays are a young and fun team to watch these days. But in this video, let's go back in time and let me tell you about the history of the Blue Jays and where they came from. Hey everybody, thanks for joining me on my channel, Brutus on Baseball. Today's video is number 4 in a series of videos I'm putting together all about team histories in Major League Baseball. I started with the Astros, the Phillies, and the Padres. In this video, I'm going to be talking all about the Toronto Blue Jays. Take a moment, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and without wasting any more time, let's get right into the history of the Toronto Blue Jays. Believe it or not, the initial plan for Toronto to get a Major League Baseball team had more to do with moving an existing franchise than creating a new one. They tried over the years to get a couple franchises in the early 70s, but it really steamed ahead prior to the 1976 season when a consortium of Toronto business owners tried to lure the San Francisco Giants to move to Toronto. It's hard to imagine it now, but the Giants of the mid-70s were down in the dumps. They had lost stars like Willie Mays, Willie McCovey, Juan Marichal over the last decade, and the team just wasn't as good anymore as it had been in its heyday. And the Cross Bay rivals, the Oakland Athletics, had just won 3 World Series in a row from 1972 to 1974. The Giants actually finished last place in attendance in 1975, begging the question that Major League Baseball was asking at that time: can the Bay Area really support 2 professional baseball teams? The Toronto ownership group went as far as designing the stadium that the Giants would play in. They were planning to keep the Giants name, by the way, but they would design an entirely new logo and color scheme for the team. But it didn't happen because the city of San Francisco was granted a restraining order in March of 1976. And by later that same month, an ownership group based in San Francisco was found that was able to keep the team in San Francisco. It's pretty crazy to think about the Giants was actually down in the dumps enough to consider moving in the 1970s. The tables certainly have turned. But this video is not a history of the Giants. It's the history of the Blue Jays. So let's get into that now. When the deal to move the San Francisco Giants fell through, Toronto immediately turned its attention to Major League Baseball's plan to expand to 2 new franchise cities in the 1977 season. The Seattle Mariners were already picked as one of them, and Toronto wanted to be that second team. And baseball decided to award Toronto with that second franchise. They'd become only the second team to be based outside of the United States, joining the Montreal Expos, who were an expansion team only 8 years earlier in 1969. But today, Toronto obviously is the only Major League team representing a city outside of the United States, as the Expos moved to Washington in 2005. Now, that first ownership group that helped to bring baseball to Toronto was headed by the Labatt Brewing Company. In the 1970s, the Canadian beer market was dominated by 3 companies, but the Labatt Company was actually in a distant third in the metropolitan Ontario area. And some marketing research showed that if they got behind baseball and bringing a team to Toronto, it would help to propel themselves forward ahead of the other 2 competitors. Now, the Blue Jays team name was selected out of a Name the Team contest, which was quite common back in those days. There were over 30,000 entries for 4,000 different team name proposals. But the Blue Jays were selected. And a lot of people think that they were selected because of the common theme of blue throughout all the Toronto sports teams. The Maple Leafs, the Argonauts, they all have a blue base color. And having the Blue Jays just added to that dynamic for the city of Toronto. And it also didn't hurt that Labatt Brewing Company was the maker of Labatt's Blue, one of their most popular beer brands at the time. Now, the Blue Jays have only played in 2 different ballparks throughout their history. The first one was Exhibition Stadium, which they played in from 1977 to 1988. And this was actually the stadium where the Toronto Argonauts, a Canadian Football League team, played. And it was renovated to be able to fit baseball into its confines. But it wasn't meant for baseball, and the plan always was from the beginning to build a new stadium. A second major problem with using Exhibition Stadium was that it was only partially covered, leaving the Toronto fans that came out to support the Blue Jays in the cold in the early and late months of the baseball season. This was no more in evidence than on opening day for the Blue Jays in their first season, April 7th, 1977, which actually started with a minor snowstorm right before game time. Now, funnily enough, even though the team was owned by a brewing company, Ontario actually had laws prohibiting the sale of alcohol at sporting events. This rule remained from 1977 all the way to 1982, so for the first 5+ seasons that the Blue Jays played there, they couldn't sell any alcohol. An exhibition stadium was often referred to by the local fans as Prohibition Stadium. And it took some time for the Blue Jays to really start making plans for their new home stadium. Construction on the Sky Dome began in 1983, and it wouldn't be until the 1989 season that they would move in. This is the first stadium in world history to have a retractable roof. And the Sky Dome was later renamed the Rogers Center in 2004, after it was purchased by the new owner, Rogers Communications, which I'll get to later. And this remains the home of the Toronto Blue Jays to this day. Now, as most expansion teams do, the Blue Jays struggled for the first several years, having losing records and finishing in last place from 1977 until 1982. They had their first winning season in 1983, and it was the beginning of 11 straight years of winning baseball in Toronto. They became division champs 2 years later in 1985 for the first time, and they became quite the formidable team in the American League East, winning 5 division championships in the 9 years between 1985 and 1993. After that, the team went through some turmoil, and they had a playoff drought from 1994 all the way to 2014. But since that time, they became a team to reckon with again, making the playoffs 4 times out of 8 between 2015 and 2022. So the Blue Jays have made the playoffs a total of 9 times out of 46 seasons, which is pretty good for an expansion franchise. And they've represented the American League in the World Series 2 times, winning both of those over the Atlanta Braves in 1992 and the Philadelphia Phillies in 1993. Now for some interesting facts about the Blue Jays' history. The Blue Jays have had a history of some interesting rivalries, including the Expos, of course, even though they didn't really play each other at the time. It was just a rivalry based on geography because they were the only 2 teams in Canada. And then, of course, there's the New York Yankees. The Yankees and their fans probably don't consider the Blue Jays a major rival. They've got the Red Sox, of course. But the Blue Jays have always had a chip on their shoulder when it comes to beating the Yankees, especially in the last 2 to 3 decades. And so for them, especially when you ask somebody like Vladimir Guerrero Jr. right now, it's definitely a heated rivalry. But the most interesting one is the rivalry between the Blue Jays and the Seattle Mariners. That one seems odd to a lot of people because those teams haven't faced each other very often, especially not in the playoffs, and they're geographically very far apart. But what makes this rivalry very interesting is that people across Canada see the Blue Jays as their team. It's Canada's team. And so you'll have a ton of people in British Columbia, Vancouver, that every time the Blue Jays come to Seattle to play, they'll make that trek down to Seattle and fill up the stadium. So oftentimes you'll see way more Blue Jay fans than Mariner fans on those weekends. The Mariners obviously cater to this. They want to bring those fans down. But it makes for an interesting rivalry between the 2 clubs when they share a fan base that's so close together, even though Toronto is thousands of miles away. Over their history, the Blue Jays have also had tremendous support by their fan base in Toronto. And their claim as Canada's team results in an extremely large catchment area for fans. The fan support really showed in the attendance figures as it began to increase starting in the mid-1980s as the Blue Jays started to win more and more. Prior to the Blue Jays, the Dodgers had set the latest attendance records in the late 1970s and early 1980s, culminating with 3.6 million fans attending Dodger games in 1982. But the Blue Jays quickly surpassed that in only their 14th season in existence in 1990, when they drew 3.9 million fans over the course of the season. And they went on to break their own record in consecutive years, drawing over 4 million fans in both 1991, 1992, and even 1993. Now, this record was eclipsed in 1993 by the expansion Colorado Rockies, who drew 4.5 million fans in that first season. But it's still important to note that the Blue Jays were the first team to break that 4 million mark in attendance, and they were able to do it year in and year out when they were good in the early 90s. Now, as I mentioned before, the Labatt Brewing Company was the primary owner, the face of the franchise ownership in the late 1970s and 1980s. But the story of ownership was actually way more complex than just this brewing company behind the team. After the Blue Jays won the World Series in 1992 and 1993, Labatt Brewing Company ran into financial trouble in 1994. And that was exacerbated by the decline in the performance of the Blue Jays in 1994, as well as the player strike and cancellation of the World Series that same season. By '94, Labatt's was actually primarily owned by various pension funds and insurance companies. In May of 1995, a private equity firm attempted a hostile takeover, but not long after that, the brewing company was actually saved by a Belgian beer maker called Interbrew. But the problem? Interbrew had very little interest in operating a baseball team, and they made that clear to Major League Baseball, asking to be granted a temporary owner until they could find a new buyer. It took several years, and they really just operated the team at the bare minimum to be able to continue fielding a team. But by the year 2000, Rogers Communications had stepped up to purchase the majority stake in the team. Canada's largest cable company paid $160 million in the year 2000 for an 80% stake in the Blue Jays. And imagine this, after paying $160 million for 80% in 2000, the Blue Jays team was recently valued at $1.8 billion this past season. Now, due to the border restrictions from the pandemic in the last few years, the Blue Jays actually couldn't play at home because any player coming to visit Toronto would have to quarantine each time. Because of that, the Blue Jays actually played their home games in Buffalo, New York in the shortened 2020 season, and then split their season in 2021 between their spring training facility in Dunedin, Florida in April and May of 2021, and then again in Buffalo in June and July of 2021 before being able to finally return home to play games in August of 2021. Now, what about uniforms? The Blue Jays uniforms have always been fairly consistent. They began in the late 1970s with either the white or the powder blue uniforms with the classic Blue Jay logo centered on the front in that split letter style that's become traditionally associated with the Jays. That uniform scheme stayed fairly consistent for the first almost 20 years until the late 1990s when red became more incorporated with the team colors. And then a sleeveless jersey with a blue undershirt was also introduced in 2000. Now, with the new ownership of the Rogers Communications, a more drastic redesign went underway just before the 2004 season, and that redesign focused more on black and blue as the main colors for the team. They changed the classic Blue Jay logo to the Jaybird design, which was seen to be much more streamlined and modern at the time. By 2012, the Blue Jays had gone back to their roots by embracing that original Blue Jays logo and color scheme with just a bit of a modernized twist. They also brought back the use of those powder blue uniforms, and to this day, they still play in their red uniforms on July 1st, Canada Day, each year. Now, the Blue Jays have had 3 general stretches of pretty decent teams throughout the history. The first one started in those mid-1980s and went through 1993, led by a group of young players like Jesse Barfield, Fred McGriff, and Dave Stieb, perhaps the best pitcher of the 1980s, and eventually evolving into younger players like Roberto Alomar, Devon White, and John Olerud in the early 1990s, along with late career rentals of Hall of Fame players like Jack Morris, Dave Winfield, Paul Molitor, and Ricky Henderson. They were the first non-US based team to play in the World Series in 1992, and it was this mix of young superstar players with more experienced veteran players that were on Hall of Fame paths that really brought the team together and glued them into a World Series winner. Now, after winning in 1992 and 1993, the team went 21 straight seasons without a playoff appearance, despite having star players that had phenomenal seasons, like Roger Clemens in 1997 and 1998, and Roy Halladay and Carlos Delgado in the 2000s. It wasn't until 2015 when there was a short run under the leadership of guys like Josh Donaldson, who won an MVP in Toronto, Jose Bautista and Edwin Encarnacion, and short-term rentals like R.A. Dickey and Troy Tulowitzki. This was a very brief period of success in the Blue Jays history, but the exclamation point on this one was the unforgettable Jose Bautista bat flip against the Texas Rangers in the playoffs in 2015. The Blue Jays crumbled over the next few seasons, and their third era of success has really been the current one, starting with a playoff appearance in 2020 and 2022, and really headed by young guys like Vlad Guerrero Jr., Bo Bichette, and Alek Manoah, and veteran players like Matt Chapman, Kevin Gossman, and Robbie Ray for a short time. There have been 2 MVP award winners that wore the Blue Jays jersey, first starting with George Bell in 1987, and like I mentioned, Josh Donaldson in 2015. There have been 5 Cy Young Award winners in the history of the Blue Jays, the first being Pat Hentgen in 1996, Roger Clemens in his dominant 1997 and 1998 seasons, Roy Halladay in 2003, and Robbie Ray in 2021. There are currently 10 players in the Hall of Fame that wore the Blue Jays jersey at one time or another. Several of these players only played a very short time for the Blue Jays, and sometimes can be forgotten. Guys like Phil Niekro, Ricky Henderson, Dave Winfield, Jack Morris, Paul Molitor, and Frank Thomas at the end of his career, as well as the most recent inductees in this year of 2023, Fred McGriff and Scott Rowland. There's only 2 players in the Hall of Fame that are heavily associated with the Blue Jays. Roberto Alomar, and Roy Halladay. And only Alomar is in the Hall of Fame with a Blue Jays cap on his plaque. Halladay was inducted into the Hall of Fame with no logo showing on his plaque, despite clearly stating at his retirement that he wanted to go in as a Blue Jay. Unfortunately, Halladay passed away in 2017 while operating a plane over the Gulf of Mexico, and so he wasn't around to be able to be inducted into the Hall of Fame personally. And we'll never know what kind of conversations he had since retirement to decide what cap or no cap to wear on the Hall of Fame plaque. In addition to players, Pat Gillick was elected to the Hall of Fame as an executive. But pioneers and executives are not affiliated with any one specific team on their plaques. Despite this, the Hall of Fame most closely associates Pat Gillick with the Toronto Blue Jays because he was the architect behind putting together both the 1992 and 1993 World Series winning teams. Now, there aren't a lot of Blue Jay players that are on the list of guys that are likely to be inducted into the Hall of Fame in coming years. Jeff Kent is likely to get in, but he only played for Toronto for an extremely brief period of time in his first season before being traded to the Mets. And of course, Roger Clemens, but who knows what his destiny in the Hall of Fame looks like. I still think he'll get in eventually, but you could be looking at another 5 to 10 year wait before he does. Even if he does get voted in, it won't be with the Blue Jays cap. So the Jays are going to have to rely on really young guys, players like Vlad Guerrero Jr. and Bo Bichette, to hopefully have Hall of Fame careers to have another representative in the future. The best Blue Jay players of all time. In terms of position players, I'd probably put Carlos Delgado as the number one of all time. And after that, there's a whole mix of players you could choose from. Jose Bautista, Tony Fernandez, Jesse Barfield, Roberto Alomar, even John Olerud. That whole list of guys could pretty much go in any order based on who was your favorite at the time. Really great players, but no surefire Hall of Famers there. Delgado is the one guy that's on the cusp. A lot of people say if Fred McGriff can get in, Delgado should be considered. I'm not quite as optimistic at Delgado's chances, mostly because of the era in which he played. His numbers were phenomenal, but just don't stack up against other players of his exact time period. The best Blue Jay pitchers of all time? Number one, I've got to go with Dave Stieb. He's the Blue Jays' all-time leader in all-star appearances with 7, and he threw the only no-hitter in Blue Jays history. Stieb didn't have the longevity that he needed for the Hall of Fame, but a lot of people think that he deserves a lot more consideration, especially that he's probably the best pitcher of the 1980s, which is a title often given to Jack Morris. But if you really dig into the numbers, it should probably be Stieb. After Stieb, I put Roy Halladay. Halladay would probably be number one if he had stayed his entire career with the Jays. But because he had so many good seasons with the Phillies as well, you have to dock him a little bit just to account for the Blue Jays history. And after Halladay, there's quite a big drop-off. Number 3, I'd probably put Jimmy Key. And then 4, Roger Clemens, because of his 2 highly dominant seasons in the Blue Jays uniform. And the number 5 position for pitchers, I'd probably put Tom Hankey, a relief pitcher that's forgotten about a lot, but he was really highly effective when he was in a Blue Jay uniform. So there you have it, the Blue Jays history from 1977 up to 2023. If you haven't seen my other videos, check out the Astros, the Phillies, and the Padres and learn more about their histories as well. And stay tuned until next time when I cover another Major League team history. In the meantime, take care of yourself, keep talking baseball, and we'll see you around.